When I was 22, I stood at a threshold, but it wasn't really the threshold I wanted to be standing at. At a time when, as a college senior, I wanted to feel like the world was at my feet, I instead found myself outside a hospital room. But it wasn't only that physical threshold that I stood at. There was an internal one, too. Because inside that room was my brother, Scott, my only sibling, my best friend. And he was in a coma after a suicide attempt. And I didn't know if I could cross that threshold into that reality, if I could become the sister who stood by his bedside and held his hand. 9 months after I entered that room, my brother Scott took his life, and I felt myself thrown into a world of grief, a world I knew nothing about, and I felt so ill-equipped to be trying to navigate it. Because there weren't only those expected experiences in grief, the sorrow, the heartache, the desperately wishing for life to be different. There were also other experiences that felt harder to describe, even a little bit shameful. When I was grieving, I found I had a greater capacity to love myself and others. And since Scott no longer had his life, I felt this newfound gratitude for mine, like grief made me feel more alive. But I didn't know how to talk about any of that, or even really how to feel it. So I stuffed it way down deep inside. And I made grief this problem that I had to solve, or something I had to get over. We all know grief. We all have our own experiences and our own ways of walking with our grief, none of which are wrong. Because we don't only experience grief in the loss of a loved one. We also experience grief when life doesn't go the way we wanted. We experience grief in the loss of a friendship or a dream, or in waking up to how hard we can be on ourselves sometimes. We experience grief when we have illness, injury, or when there's injustice. There's even ecological grief, political grief, and social grief. I even think that there is the subtle grief of being gifted this moment, this precious gem of an experience, and in an instant, it's gone, never to be reclaimed because we can't hold onto life. It keeps slipping through our fingers. So in some ways, big and small, grief colors all of life. But we don't really have a way of talking about it or making grief a part of our collective experience. And so we do stuff it inside. And honestly, that might work for some people. And for others, it might work for a time. But in my own experience, I felt like I couldn't bring my whole self to my life anymore. Like there was this part of me that I had deemed acceptable and normal and was predictable. And there was this other part that felt shaky and vulnerable and sometimes a little broken. And I became half a person straddling worlds. And finally, I just didn't want that for myself anymore, that half life. And I knew that Scott wouldn't want that for me either. So I decided to do something completely different. My brother Scott had been a huge theater nerd growing up, and I had followed in his footsteps. And so I decided to bring my grief to the stage in the form of a one-woman play that I wrote and produced and performed in. And I brought all of my questions and curiosities and joys and pains. And then I asked audiences to have a discussion with me afterwards. I wanted to create an experience where grief felt like it was normalized, like we could connect over it. And in those discussions, some really amazing things happened. Sometimes grief feels too big for one person to hold. Do you ever feel that way? Like it just overwhelms us. And I think that's because we weren't designed to grieve alone. Because nobody's grief was too big for that group to hold together. And even though we all had our own stories, our own backgrounds, there was something fundamental about our experience of grief, something that felt shared. And by coming together around it, it felt like we could heal a little bit, just a little bit, together. I would like to take a moment now and share a piece of my performance with you. It's near the end. I'm alone in a room, waiting for Skype to load on my computer. And on that call, my parents will tell me that Scott is dead. And as I'm waiting and waiting for it to load, I notice a mirror above the desk. And looking into it, I can see that we're all there. Dad's eyes, Mom's nose, Scott's eyebrows, and Laura's mouth. They live on in me as I live on in them. And even in my pain, I'm not really alone. I think that this is one of the gifts of grief, that it can connect us, that I could see a sparkle in your eye as you talk about a loved one, and it could remind me of what I feel for Scott. Or I could listen to your experiences of grief, and some of your words might feel like they're pulled right out of my heart. We all know grief. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy to grieve or comfortable. It's not. And so the next time you feel yourself grieving, if the things that you've been trying aren't working for you anymore, and you want to try something different, I'd like to make 3 recommendations of what makes me feel a little more stable when I'm overwhelmed by grief. The first is just to allow it. Grief is not a sign that you are broken. It's not a sign that something needs to be fixed or gotten over. It is a normal human experience. We grieve big because we love big, and we're equipped to feel both. And my second recommendation is to be gentle with yourself. We can be so hard on ourselves sometimes. Do you feel that? so demanding. But grief doesn't respond to demands or to-do lists or timelines. It has its own meandering journey, and the best way to allow it to unfold is to be gentle. And my last recommendation is to find someone you love, someone you trust, and ask them to just be with you. Not to fix you, not to make you feel different or better, but just to sit with you and let you know you're not alone. And people often ask me, I want to support somebody who's grieving, but I don't know what to say. Those elusive right words. I don't know if there are right words or wrong words. Everybody's so different, and even one person's grief changes over time. But if somebody has asked you to sit with them in their grief, here are a few things you could try saying. You could say to them, I am so sorry for your loss, for your pain. You could say, I see you, I hear you, and I choose you just as you are. You could say, I don't really know what to say right now, but I'd like to be here with you while you're grieving. I'd like to hold your hand as you cross that threshold. Because maybe what's on the other side isn't so scary or uncomfortable or even painful if you and I, if we go together. Thank you.